The International Court of Justice in The Hague has ordered Israel to stop its military offensive in the city of Rafah in southern Gaza. The UN's top court described the humanitarian situation there as disastrous and ordered Israel to allow unhindered access of aid. But Israel rejected the ruling and says its operations against Hamas, a group considered a terrorist organisation by multiple countries, will continue.
Far from the front lines of the war in Gaza, Israel's military campaign suffered a major legal blow.
Israel must immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah governorate which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part.
The latest ICJ ruling unequivocal about the need for Israel to protect Palestinians and do more to provide vital aid.
The unhindered provision at scale by all concerned of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance, and of quote, necessitates that the respondent maintain open land crossing points, and in particular the Rafah crossing.
The decision welcomed by South Africa, which brought the case and has accused Israel of committing genocide.
This order is groundbreaking, as it is the first time that explicit mention is made for Israel to halt its military action in any area of Gaza, this time specifically in Rafah.
Israel rejects accusations of genocide and the latest ICJ ruling. War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz said the fight to return its hostages would continue, including in Rafah. The ICJ also ordered the unconditional release of hostages being held by Hamas. While the court has no way of enforcing the ruling, it poses a major challenge for Israel's allies.
We have to choose between our support to the international institution and the rule of law or our support to Israel. And both things is going to be quite difficult to make compatible.
The ruling is the second blow to Israel's war this week. The International Criminal Court has applied for arrest warrants for Israel's Prime Minister and Defence Minister over war crimes. Both judicial decisions adding to growing global criticism of Israel's war.
Well, Marc Weller is Professor of International Law and International Constitutional Studies at the University of Cambridge in the UK. He told me more about the court's reasoning.
Well, Israel is, of course, entitled to the right to self-defense in response to the horrible, atrocious events of the 7th of October. But the right to self-defense is not unlimited, and it can never transgress humanitarian law, the law that supports the dignity of human persons, human beings, in any circumstance, even in war. And the court has now spoken for the third time in just a few months, which is unprecedented, ordering Israel the first time not to do anything which could constitute acts of genocide against the people of Gaza, the Palestinians. The second time, it has ordered Israel to ensure that there is full humanitarian access. And now, almost unprecedentedly, it has ordered a state claiming to be in the middle of a self-defense operation to halt a major element of that campaign, its Rafah offensive.
OK. So let's pick up the two. You mentioned there two previous rulings there, nothing that constitutes genocide and full humanitarian access. Today's ruling required Israel to provide verification or to allow verification of humanitarian access, which seems to indicate that the court does not believe that Israel has complied with its earlier ruling.
Well, it certainly hasn't complied in the sense that the court has found that the situation has gotten much worse. And therefore, very unusually, it has made yet a further ruling in this case. And the court is very, very concerned about the future of those individuals who were sent to Rafah as a safe place by Israel to escape the consequences of the fighting, and who are now being displaced from there without adequate measures have been taken to ensure their survival in other places. And the court has noticed that no such adequate steps have been taken.
OK, so there we have a problem, don't we? Because the court rules do something about humanitarian access. The court rules today against Israel and says, stop what's going on in Rafah and let us check that you've complied with our earlier ruling. We heard yesterday from an Israeli government spokesman who was quoted as saying, no power on earth will stop Israel from protecting its citizens and going after Hamas in Gaza. The court can rule until it's blue in the face. Where's its or else?
Well, how many legions does the Pope have, as was famously asked? The court doesn't have an army to enforce its wishes. It could have an army if the UN Security Council were able to exercise its role, because the UN Security Council has, in principle, the power to enforce judgments of the court. But of course, with the US veto, that is not possible. And therefore, it is the very, very significant diplomatic pressure. You saw the indictments by the International Criminal Court in relation to Mr. Netanyahu.
A completely separate court, we should say.
And those have been backed up now yet again, in addition to their individual responsibility, by these actions directed towards the state of Israel. And it really makes the diplomatic space for Israel much, much more difficult to maneuver in. Israel has been arguing, we have been a model of humanitarian law compliance. But with all of this evidence, those arguments ring increasingly hollow, as most people who watch television, of course, already know.
Okay.
But once you have these authoritative findings from the highest judicial bodies in the world, it is much more difficult for Israel to maintain its position that it is, in a modest way, defending itself.
Does this ruling impose any duties or obligations on any other signatories to the court to do or not do anything? I'm thinking of the United States, amongst others, who it could be argued are supplying Israel with the wherewithal to carry out the activities that the court has now prohibited.
Funny you should say that, as, of course, you are hinting at. Germany is at present subject to a case in the International Court of Justice, where Nicaragua has argued that the continued provision of arms by Germany to Israel violates the Genocide Convention. And for a state like Germany, which prides itself as a model of compliance with international law, on the one hand, but which also wants to remain a very strong friend of Israel, that is a real huge dilemma coming up for it. The United States will not likely consider the court in relation to its arms exports, which are, of course, quite massive. The United Kingdom may be in a different position because under its ministerial code, it cannot license the export of weapons, if these weapons are likely to be used against international law or certainly in favor of a campaign of genocide. These various pronouncements, again, make the space to maneuver for Israel and for its allies significantly smaller. Doesn't end the conflict, but it is another piece in the mosaic which will help, I think, persuade Israel ultimately to try not to isolate itself entirely from the international community.
And just a final word on genocide, because today's ruling is a part of a broader lawsuit brought by South Africa last year accusing Israel of committing genocide in Gaza. Just explain to us briefly what impact today's decision has on that.
Well, this is part of that case. It is the third interim action by the court to protect the people of Palestine during the many years it will take the court to give the actual ruling as to whether or not genocide has taken place. So this action does not actually prejudice the finding of the court at the end of that lengthy period of legal argument as to whether or not genocide occurred. Remember the Bosnian case, where most thought we were faced with a significant campaign of genocide. And after many years of deliberation, the court found that Srebrenica was genocide, but the rest of this dreadful campaign of crimes against humanity didn't quite measure up to that high legal standard.
That's very clear, Professor. Thank you so much for walking us through that. Professor Marc Weller from the University of Cambridge. Mary Ellen O'Connell is Professor of Law and Professor of International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame in the United States. One of her numerous books is Self-Defense Against Non-State Actors. She joins us from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Welcome to DW, Professor. This ruling sounds pretty unequivocal. Not a lot of wiggle room for Israel.
There is no wiggle room in this order. Remember, it's the third order issued by the International Court of Justice in this case. The two prior orders have been defied. People are still dying in large numbers, especially civilians, especially children. The court, like everyone in the world, including President Biden, sees this operation against Rafah as nothing short of catastrophic. The court has ordered a halt to this operation. What else could it do?
Well, Israel has said all along that it has pursued these actions in the defense of its citizens following that barbarous attack by Hamas terrorists. Why wasn't that enough for the court?
Israel's argument, its attempted justification, has flaws in it on a number of levels. On the first level, the International Court itself has ruled in 2004 that a war, an all-out war, under the UN Charter's recognition of the right of self-defense, cannot be waged against a zone of occupation by the occupier. Of course, Israel can take defensive measures. It can do whatever it wants on its own territory to defend from incoming attacks, further terrorist attacks, but it cannot launch an all-out war. Having launched this war, in defiance of the court's own prior decision, it then has to comply with certain rules derived from the Geneva Conventions, known as international humanitarian law, that whatever your military objective is, you have to first and foremost distinguish between fighters and civilians. You must only carry out those operations that are necessary to accomplish the military objective, not cause disproportionate loss of civilian life, and at all times remember humanity, the humanity of the victims of armed conflict and the fighters' own, the Israeli soldiers' own humanity. And the court has had evidence brought by South Africa that Israel is not complying with either its prior ruling in the Wall case or these fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, not allowing food in sufficiently, the very high number of deaths which are not just when you drop a bomb on an apartment building in the hope of getting one potential fighter, this is the very definition of disproportionate. The court has said time and again, yes, Israel can take defensive measures. It must respond and protect its own citizens, as every country does against terrorism.
Okay.
Police measures appropriate to the challenge.
But
the
did you
court
say
does not see
the court has ruled repeatedly about Israel's conduct. I think you said this was the third ruling. And one of today's rulings was that Israel must allow investigators to establish whether it has complied with a previous ruling. So where is the or else? The court can rule till it's blue in the face if Israel just sits there and says, I don't care.
Well, one of the clear consequences of Israel not complying with the prior two orders, it didn't comply with the first order in January, so then the second order came in March. It didn't comply with the second order. The third order has come. And this order, as you pointed out, is really definitive, is as clear and as black and white as any order the International Court has ever issued. It means not only that Israel must comply, but every state in the international community whose law we're talking about, the law of the international community, has to assist the court, has to assist South Africa in bringing enforcement. We all know that the country most in a position to really help enforce this most recent order is the United States. President Biden himself has warned Israel about this Rafah offensive. He's the last country that's providing really extensive weapons, offensive weapons to Israel. President Biden is the person I want to listen to this order and say, okay, we must halt delivery of offensive weapons to Israel. Israel has to know it's alone in believing that what it's doing complies with the law, because it does not.
And following on from that, does this ruling open up the possibility of international sanctions against Israel?
Possibly, but I think sanctions are beside the point at this moment. What really needs to happen is for the Israeli government to listen to its own people, to listen to people around the world saying, we do not want this kind of carnage in our name, this kind of a failure to comply with the law. We do not want to be lawbreakers. We want to be those who uphold the rule of law. That sanctions are not necessarily a great option. It is a sanction, of course, for the U.S. to withhold weapons. Lots of countries now have changed fundamentally their position vis-a-vis Israel because of its failure to comply with international law, either as exemplified or as explained by the court, or as their own legal advisors have seen this. At this point, we've seen sanctions not doing as much as they should do to persuade Russia. I don't think sanctions beyond withholding weapons are really going to be the thing that moves Israel now.
Okay.
But whatever it takes, I'm happy to hear governments stepping up.
Let's talk about two things today's court ruling hasn't ordered. Number one, a ceasefire, and number two, any ruling on whether or not Israel has committed genocide.
It cannot, on the second point, it cannot rule on that point definitively yet. These are emergency orders that the court has been ruling. These three sets of orders are emergency orders, provisional measures, pending the outcome of a full case on the merits. So until that happens, the court cannot rule definitively on whether genocide is occurring or has occurred by the time it rules on the merits. As the court said after its first set of orders in January, there's plausible indications of genocide, but it is in no position, and it would be a defiance of its own rules, to make a definitive finding on that point right now. So that's the first one. Please remind me of your second question.
The ceasefire. So no talk in this ruling of a ceasefire in the whole of this conflict.
Remember, the first two orders are more comprehensive. They apply throughout Gaza, and they say that Israel has to take all these measures to prevent genocide. That's as much as it's unfortunately, from my point of view, it's not a case about peace and compliance with the prohibition on the use of force. It's a case about the Genocide Convention. So the court, before it's made its full findings in the case in a preliminary way, is trying to ensure that the Genocide Convention is not violated. So it's pointing out to Israel that it's got to take more measures to ensure that what Israel is doing is not eliminating the Palestinian people in whole or in part. And that's a different goal than perhaps if it had a more general basis for ruling on violations by Israel in Gaza. So it's limited in terms of the treaty under which the case is brought.
Thank you so much for talking us through that, Professor. Professor Mary Ellen O'Connell from Notre Dame University in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's take a look then at potential Israeli and American reactions to this ruling. The Atlantic Council's an American think tank in the field of international affairs, and Alissa Pavia is Associate Director, Middle East Programs. She joins us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to DW. Can we start with your thoughts on this latest ruling against Israel?
Of course, and thank you for having me. So this latest ruling against Israel comes in the wake of a week where we've seen a number of other instances occur in the international community that have been quite outspoken against Israel. And so the first one was the ICC arrest warrants that were made at the beginning of the week against both Israeli and Hamas leaders. And on the Israel side, those were against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense. And subsequent to that, we also saw a number of European Union countries that have come out in defense of Palestine by backing and by backing the creation of a Palestinian state. And these are Ireland, Norway, and Spain. And
so this much we've covered. I'd like your thoughts. Time is short, obviously. I'd like your thoughts on today's ruling.
Of course. So on today's ruling, this obviously is a ruling by the ICJ that is trying to pressure Israel into not going into Rafah, and the ICJ is eager to see a more international pressure onto Israel. And of course, as the person before me covered, this will likely hinge on whether the United States will want to support or not the ICJ's ruling, because the ICJ on its own doesn't have much of an enforcement mechanism onto this ruling. But the way it can enforce it is through a United Nations Security Council resolution. But for that to happen, the United States needs to be in favor of that and can't veto that.
And deafening silence so far from the White House. Why do you think that is?
Deafening silence. They are deciding on the next steps. The United States has had somewhat of an ambiguous role or an ambiguous way of deciding on these latest instances when it comes to Israel. We've seen a two-tier approach when it comes to President Biden specifically, where in public, in some instances, he's been more vocal and critical of Israel, but in other instances, but he's mostly in practice supported Israel's war in Gaza. And so as of now, and also as of now that we've heard of Benjamin Netanyahu agreeing to speak at Congress again in defiance of President Biden, this may bring to a greater wedge between the relationship between Netanyahu and Biden that may have an effect on the way President Biden decides to tackle this latest ruling. Okay, so this wedge being driven between the leaders of the United States and Israel, except that when we had the announcement from the International Criminal Court prosecutor this week, there was virtually no delay from the United States in condemning this move. That is correct. There was no delay. Again, the sense is that because Benjamin Netanyahu is going to defy President Biden and Congress and speak in front of Congress, this may be the moment for President Biden to strike back against Prime Minister Netanyahu. But it is also likely that he may not do that, because up until now, he has been forceful in his backing and supporting Israel through providing military and financial support, by vetoing UN Council resolutions. So the sense is that he is waiting to kind of provide more pressure onto Biden, but at the end, he will again oppose the ICJ ruling.
Is there an argument that Benjamin Netanyahu's government has actually gone too far to row back now, having declared their intention to destroy Hamas and rescue the hostages? Must they now keep going?
The argument on Israel's side is that Rafah is the last goalpost where Hamas is hiding, and if they don't continue now, they will not be able to win, essentially, the war that they started in October. President Biden has said repeatedly that to an extent he agrees, but he also disagrees with it in the sense of wanting to see Israel be more cognizant of civilian casualties. Okay. But at the same time, yeah.
We're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. Alissa Pavia from the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Well, from Ontario, Canada, let's now bring in Michael Lynk, Professor of Law and also a former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Palestinian territories. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us again here on DW. Professor Lynk, how much of a blow is this ruling for Israel?
Well, it's another blow in another remarkable week with respect to international law, as your commentator mentioned. The arrest warrants application that was announced on Monday by the prosecutor was certainly devaluing Israel's reputation in the international community. The remarks by three European countries on Wednesday to recognize Palestine as a state was a further diplomatic blow. And today, with the International Court of Justice ruling on the further application by South Africa, concluded that Israel must immediately halt its military offensive in Rafah, and it must maintain the Rafah crossing, which Israel controls from the Palestinian side. It must maintain that open in order to allow the unhindered flow of humanitarian aid, which is probably at the very worst stage that it's been in the 7.5 months of this awful war. So, it's hard to imagine how much lower Israel's international reputation can go, and if it proceeds as it appears it will with its full-blown Rafah offensive, I suspect we'll see more condemnation of Israel in the days and weeks to come.
Yeah, and talking about other countries, let's go a bit deeper there, because the court doesn't really have the ability to force Israel to comply. But does this ruling impose any duties or obligations on other countries to do or not do anything? Countries like the US and Germany, for example, which are supplying Israel with weapons.
Sure. I mean, it doesn't affect them directly, but certainly there could be domestic litigation in both countries, because they are by far the largest arms suppliers to Israel, as you mentioned, to try to go to the courts in each country to say that there's complicity in Germany's actions in an offensive that both the World Court has wound up condemning and has been condemned at the General Assembly of the United Nations as well. So this may well up opening up domestic challenges that will build upon what the court has said.
Yeah, it'll definitely be interesting to see how that pans out. But this ruling is just one part of a broader complaint that South Africa filed late last year, accusing Israel of committing genocide in Gaza. What impact does today's decision have on that?
Well, it probably continues to hearten the court with respect to Israel's conduct. If you had a visual view of what the audience in the court looked like today, there were 3 lawyers representing Israel, and the rest of the seats where ordinarily a very large Israeli delegation would be seated were entirely empty. And I'm not sure that was meant as contempt by Israel for the court, or that was meant as a resignation, knowing what the court's ruling was likely going to be.
So this is all fairly objective so far, but Professor, I'd like to ask you what your opinion is. What do you think this ruling will actually accomplish?
Well, in the short run, it won't accomplish anything. Israel has shown disdain for the 3 prior rulings that the International Court has issued with respect to the South African application. And remember, the South African application for charges of genocide against Israel won't be heard in full by the court for probably several years down the road. We're measuring by the same yardstick the proceedings against Myanmar brought by the Gambia at the International Court of Justice. But it will continue, I think, to deeply stain Israel's diplomatic and political standing in the world. I think we've already seen, obviously, on campuses in Europe and particularly in North America, the kind of uprising that are calling upon their universities to stop academic relationships and investments in Israel. All of this, I think, will continue. There's no sign of a ceasefire being reached in Gaza. I suspect even if Israel was to win all of its war gains and decapitate Hamas politically and militarily, that will take a large number of months yet. So I suspect this kind of protest, these kinds of legal actions, this kind of political censor against Israel will continue through the summer.
Well, Professor Michael Lynk, thank you so much for your expertise and your analysis there. Thanks for being with us here on DW again.
Thank you very much for having me.